Welcome, everyone. My name is Connell O'Donovan, and I am the chair of the Education Committee for the Utah Queer Historical Society. This is my lovely assistant with our committee, Becky Moss. Who else? Terry's the lovely sexretary for our organization.
Wow.
I'm really excited about tonight's presentation, but before we get to that, next month's oratory will be Fran Pruin.
Prine.
Is it Prine?
Fran Prine.
Thank you. I've been mispronouncing her name for years now. She's been really involved with theater and architecture locally, and she was director of the Pride Center for a while, wasn't she, in an early incarnation?
Not that she was. I
Maybe
know
she's on the board.
She was chair of the board of KRCL.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fran has worn many hats in our community and has done a lot. So I'm really excited to have her come. And what's the date on that? Do you have a calendar quick?
February, hold on a moment.
It's always the last Wednesday.
Yeah. I have her down for February 26th.
Here at 6:30. And then in March, the March oratory is Mark Lawrence.
Yeah, the 25th.
Who from
March
Restore
25th, yeah.
Restore Our Humanity, was that the organization he did? Lots of hard work with our community. So I'm really excited about that.
He opened the door for marriage.
Marriage equality, I think. So Mark, yeah. Tonight, we have the lovely Jerry Buie, LCSW. And I've known Jerry for a long time, mainly through a Native American dance that we participated with in Oregon years ago. And you've been involved with an organization called Queer Spirit.
Yeah.
And
Pride Counseling.
Pride Counseling.
Sage.
Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to let Jerry take it away and tell us his story. Heckling is totally welcome. And
So do you want me to sit or stand, or what do we do?
you're the one who asked for the chair. So you can do either.
Well, and my understanding is what do you want me to do?
Hi, my name's Jerry, and I was born.
So, just my story?
Your story. We want to hear your story.
And you said coming out story too.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 hours? Yeah, so my name's Jerry Buie. I'm a clinical social worker here in Salt Lake City. And so I guess I kind of anticipate a question and answer, so I'll just kind of tell you my story. It is kind of interesting. One of kind of my platforms and the places that I work and share is this encouragement that queer folks understand their history and become acquainted with their history. Because I think in the early movement, people didn't understand their history. And I think we were fighting for rights without having the conversations of who we are. And we're accumulation of that history. So it's a little humbling to be here to say, well, I guess I'm part of history now? No. And just because I lived a little bit longer than everyone else, I guess. So
You're embracing your elderhood.
I'm embracing my elderhood. I'm enjoying it. So I'm originally from outside Detroit, Michigan, in a rural town called Wixom, Michigan. And I grew up there till I was 18 and couldn't wait to escape. And went into the military. I was very conscious of my sexual attractions, because as a kid, I think that's as far as you can go is around attractions. But I was very much aware of my sexual attractions when I was a kid growing up in Michigan in the 70s. At the same time, I was also keenly aware of what was happening in the media around gay and lesbian issues. And could clearly deduct that it was not a positive trait to have. And about the same time, when I'm hitting about the age of 12, I recognized, or I had a an aunt come out as a lesbian. And I grew up in a Sicilian family, and then my family joined Mormonism. And so that went off like a lead pipe in a deep pool.
When did that happen, that they converted? How old were
My
you?
family? I was 10.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this raised a considerable amount of angst. And all I just remember as a kid thinking gay equaled bad, and I had to fix that. So at 18, I joined the military, because that's where you go to become a man. That's where you go to enhance your masculinity. It's also where a lot of cute guys hang out. I remember going through the induction process into the military, and at that time, to be gay in the military was not permissible. And they interview you, they sit down and say, do you consider yourself, or have you ever been gay or attracted to men? And I remember I had never been sexually active at that point in my life, so I felt like I could kind of cheat the question. So the closet was well fortified, and then I did the next best thing. I got out of the military and went on a Mormon mission. And I was pretty committed to Mormonism. I had a very strong conversion experience while in the military, and although that commitment spiritually was very deep and profound, it also, I seen it as an antidote to my gayness. And so I became incredibly committed to how do I change and rectify my sexual orientation, and it's going to be through the military, and it's going to be through Mormonism. And so I really became very fanatical in my relationship with my religion. And so when I came home off, and I was one of those missionaries that nobody liked, because we got up at 6 in the morning and we wouldn't go to bed till 10, and I made sure, because in my mind is if I work hard enough, God will cure this thing. And I should also back up. There was a period where, and I'm just disclosing this because as a therapist I can tell you that I don't think my story is terribly unique, but I think it's an important narrative for people to know. I had read somewhere that God could cure all things by fasting, and I got it in my head, and I basically fasted for 3 years. And when I discharged from the military, I discharged at 123 pounds. I weigh 150 no. As you can see, I fully recovered.
But what do you mean by you fasted for 3 years? Like, you would eat a meal and then fast 24 hours?
No, I really stopped eating and would maybe throughout the week have some crackers. And I would drink water, but I just stopped. And I do not classify that as an eating disorder, even though I think technically it constitutes an eating disorder. It was a very deep commitment that if I did this, then I would be cured. And I think self-harming behaviors under these circumstances are not unique. And I've certainly have seen that with clients in terms of suicidal ideation or self-harm kind of behavior. I went through that experience myself. So I got off my mission, still feeling pretty gay. So I did the next best thing and went to BYU. And there I became, so throughout this process I was working with different therapists who, at that time, conversion therapy was called reparative therapy. And so I was involved in reparative and conversion forms of therapy. And my first experience with a therapist who happened to belong to my church, I finally got the guts to tell him that I thought I was gay. And he kind of looked at me and he said, I know this is going to be hard to believe, but he looked at me and said, well, you don't show any of the symptoms. Oh, good. No. I'm so glad to hear that.
Clutch the pearls.
So it was interesting, even the first therapist wasn't very helpful because he wasn't really listening to what I was saying. But when I went to BYU, I got involved in their conversion therapy program that they had at BYU at that time.
What year was that?
Well, between 89 and 92.
Okay.
Yeah.
That should be something that ought to be considered.
Whoa.
I'll rethink that. No. And that became a pretty distressful time. I will also go back and say this. When I was in the military, I had 2 suicide attempts. I had become so discouraged at my lack of becoming heterosexual and being successful. And at that time, Miracle for Forgiveness was kind of like the textbook in Mormonism around repentance. And President Kimball was pretty clear about death was preferred over these kinds of sins. And I took that to heart. And there were times when I became so kind of destitute and discouraged that I seriously considered and actually attempted suicide.
Were you sexually active?
Nope.
Never.
I was never sexually active until after I graduated from BYU.
Okay.
So this was all about a sense of identity.
Quick question, what did the military do with those suicide attempts?
So they never knew about the suicide attempts, but there was this question about why I kept passing out at work. Because I'm fasting, and they didn't understand the weight loss. And so there were some psych evaluations that were done to say, what's going on here? And what's interesting is the psychologist could tell that I was being pretty defensive and guarded about it, because I wasn't going to disclose what was really going on. And the therapy that I was doing was not related to the military experience. So there was this question going on about why is he losing so much weight, what's happening. And if you think about the stories around sexism, nobody thought to think about an eating disorder. They thought it was a medical condition. No one asked when was the last time I ate. So I go to BYU, and I get involved in this conversion therapy thing. I hate basketball. I still hate basketball. That's kind of the conversion therapy mentality, as if we get you involved in more masculine kind of boy activities, that you'll somehow become more boy-like.
Healthy male bonding.
Wow.
Yeah. and so I participated out of a sense of kind of religious responsibility. I was actually kind of being counseled at that time, and this was, I think, fairly typical, that I'm a returned missionary. I'm a single young man. I should get married. And I kind of went to BYU thinking this is where I'm going to meet a wife. And so I got married. The woman I married, we share a child. She's an amazing woman today. She was an amazing woman then. But we kind of reached a place in the relationship where my daughter was born. I could not really, we made great friends and great companions, but we were not, intimacy was not an enjoyable thing. And when I say intimacy, like, it wasn't like I wanted to cuddle with her or even hold her hand. Even though we slept in the same bed, we kind of had our own kind of, I had my own covers, the blankets and that. I mean, as much distance as I could create. Now, she's a heterosexual woman, though, right? And so what do you think was happening to her psyche? Right? It was being attacked. And I just remember one night hearing her cry in the bathroom, and I was thinking, I can't keep doing this. And so one of the first, during this time in graduate school, I was taking a diversity class, and we were writing reaction papers, and I basically came out to this professor. I said, I'm 20-something years old, I'm LDS, I work at the Utah State Prison, and I'm gay, and I've never said that before, and this is how I imagine my life being. And that paper was eventually published, but at that time we handed in papers to professors, and she wrote on the bottom, "See me now!" Exclamation point. Does this mean I'm getting an A? So I went and visited with her, and she connected me with a therapist, and that therapist really helped me to kind of evolve the story of my life, and to really kind of look at it, and then I disclosed to my wife what was happening, and which is interesting because there were no more secrets. We kind of had this moment where we came closer together, like secrets were gone, and we just kind of reached this place of recognizing that we wanted our daughter to be raised in a more kind of authentic place of intimacy. Like, as parents, you model relationships. And even though I loved her and we had a relationship, any kid would be able to see through it. And so we separated, and then ended up, divorcing. And so it really worked out well, because I have my ex-wife is a hairdresser, and so Fridays and Saturdays were really busy days for her. And so I ended up having my daughter every weekend. So then I started exploring the gay community, and it's interesting being in this center. Do you remember the Stonewall Center?
The first one?
Yes, the red one. It was a red building. I think it was red. I remember first of all, finding them was a bit difficult, because if you don't know queer history, then you have no idea what Stonewall's about. And so I'd be looking we had books called phone books in those days, and I would try to find something that was gay in the phone book. And I never thought to look for Stonewall, because I had no idea what it was. But I remember finding this place, and how many times I would go and park in front of the Stonewall Center, because I desperately wanted to go in and was terrified at the same time.
Wow.
And then I eventually went in and had a really bad experience, and it confirmed all my deepest fears, and I ran screaming out.
What happened?
Frankly, I think some very well-meaning people just kind of suddenly wanted to saturate me, when I just kind of wanted to walk in and just kind of like, what's going to happen here? And I eventually ended up with a job where I had a colleague who was gay, and so he took me to my first gay bar experience and took me around to different events, and that kind of opened the door for me. So fast forward, I eventually met my partner, or my husband now. We've been together for 25 years. We met at a gym that I was working out at, and actually met at a bar called The Sun. We all had our relationships there at The Sun. Sometimes in the parking lot, sometimes no. But we kind of met socially at The Sun, and very quickly we kind of recognized our attractions and our feelings about things, and we shared some very similar interests, and one of that was around spirituality. And we developed into a relationship. I mean, we committed to just dating for a year and see what that would look like, and I ended up needing to move, and so we decided to move in together, and I've never moved out since. So in graduate school, I got my LCSW, and at the University of Utah, and I recognized one thing that was happening frequently for folks is they would seek out therapy. But in those days, you didn't know if your therapist was going to accept you or not. And so a lot of people would do therapy in the closet. I would just talk about my issues, but not ever talk about who I am. Or if you would disclose to your therapist that you were gay or lesbian or transgender, and they would very quickly become pathologized, or the therapist would play voyeur. They will tell me what that's like, and how does that work? And so I decided at the time I was working for the Division of Child and Family Services. Prior to that, I was working at the Utah State Prison, and I thought, as a therapist, I love the work I'm doing, but I kind of want to work with clients who want therapy as opposed to fighting for it or fighting against it. And so I thought, I'm just going to open up a practice, and I put something in the Pillar, which was a gay paper in those days, and just, Jerry Buie, and I had a little catchphrase in there like a gay therapist or something to just let people know that I was gay identified. And before I knew it, I had more clients than I knew what to do with. And so I was like asking questions like, well, why are you what is it that's bringing you in? And people were saying that it was difficult for them to find therapy of like-minded, somebody who would understand them without being the voyeur, without pathologizing them. And they would say things like, the minute I told my therapist that I was gay, right, suddenly that's all we talked about, and we stopped talking about my issues. And so I think people in the community recognized that we could start at a common cultural competency level. And so what I did is I started recognizing I couldn't work at DCFS and do a practice. So I happened to have another colleague who was gay, and in those days we did have gay organizations with therapists, but therapists were afraid to be out. And so we started marching in the Gay Pride Parade. We started creating some visibility to say, and so there might be 4 of us, but we were the gay therapist of Salt Lake City, right? And now in those parades, you might get 30 or 40 people show up who are willing to march. But we would be marching and see all of our therapist friends on the streets, and they'd wave and blow us kisses, and we'd say, "Come join us," and they didn't want to be identified. And
what year did you open up your practice?
Well, I started. So my practice kind of started under my name, like around 95, 96. And then it developed into Pride Counseling maybe around 97, 98. Yeah. And so I was taking a position, when we teach people how to be therapists, we talk about being objective and people shouldn't kind of be in your business. And we were treating queer identities as if that was something private. It was like, well, if I were a person of color as a therapist, that would be pretty evident. Or if I were speaking a different language, that would be pretty evident. Who I am as a queer individual I don't think that has to be a secret to be effective. And so I was really kind of promoting this idea of being out as therapists so that our community could find us. And that's why I picked Pride Counseling. I thought, how can I name this in a way that people could just recognize, oh, they'll get me.
Was it a brick and mortar place, or was this just a network of
both. We created a network through NASW,
Okay.
And then NASW shut us down. And National Association of Social Workers has a Utah chapter. And so we had an LGBT group within the context of the National Association of Social Workers. But they were concerned that we were becoming too visible in impacting the overall membership of NASW. And so they shut us down. They shut us down. We had a HIV/AIDS group and a women's group, and all 3 of them got shut down. And then it wasn't shortly after that Jim Struve came into town. And so we were talking about this history, and then he brought about the LGBT Therapist Guild. And he's like a gay hippie, and he gets it, and he's organized an amazing network. But then Pride Counseling, I created an actual agency.
With a building then?
Yeah, we had.
Where was that located?
Well, we started out in Holiday,
Okay.
and then we grew to Denver Street downtown, and then we were across the street from the library, and then we moved over to First South and 4th East. And at that time, I had 7 therapists. I had an APRN. We offered classes, psychoeducational classes. We did a lot of court-ordered services, so people were being court-ordered. You know, for instance, a queer couple might get sent to domestic violence court, but they were being referred to programs that were only in consideration of heterosexual couples. And so I networked with the judges and the probation officers and said, look, stop sending folks to programs that aren't really addressing their needs. And let me talk to you about what we can offer. And so even though I wasn't like on the directory, most of the judges knew when they had LGBT couples or families in distress, they would refer them. And even to this day, I still get referrals, even though my practice is very different today. So we had 7 therapists. I had an APRN. We had a pretty...
What's an APRN?
Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody who does psychiatric care, medications. Yeah. And so we became a very collaborative agency model in addressing mental health issues in our community. And because I had these other therapists, it gave me an opportunity to kind of be a queer mental health advocate, if you will. And so I did a lot of community education, did a lot of education through a psychology association, social work associations, a lot of local trainings, national trainings, and was really kind of out there promoting. Now everyone does it. But back in the early 90s and early 2000s, it wasn't really a terribly popular thing in the therapeutic circles. And so it gave us a lot of visibility and gave me an opportunity to be more of an advocate, even though I was doing therapy, but I had therapists that I trained who could do that piece. And then one of the issues that concerned me frequently was I recognized how a lot of queer folks had internalized homophobia, transphobia. You know, we grow up in societies that send out a lot of narratives about what we think you should be. And in the space of the closet or lack of community, we internalize that. And I recognize that a lot of that was religiously based. And so if God's rejected me, then I reject myself, and I live up to all the stereotypical kinds of ideas and norms. And so myself and a guy by the name of John Cottrell, as my spiritual path deepened in an understanding around different indigenous kinds of ideas, through some mentors that I had in my life around this time, and John studies kind of a yoga meditative path, we decided to create this group called Queer Spirit. And the idea of Queer Spirit was to get queer men together in non-party spaces, if you will, but to bring people together. And it was inspired by Harry and the sex magic workshops and the fairy work, was to bring queer men together in kind of sacred space, outdoors, and to create circles of ceremony, circles of dialogue around the issues of who are we. Harry Hayes used to talk about the theory of Darwinism, and I think it's a pretty interesting concept. Theory of Darwinism says that a species ceases to exist when its purpose has been fulfilled or no longer useful. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that queer people are becoming more visible and more noticeable? We're there. We're not becoming extinct. Even though we can't reproduce, we're growing. So he would say, if we're growing, that means somehow evolution has chosen us to fulfill some particular purpose.
We have a role to play.
We have a role to play. And so the question with Queer Spirit is, what is the role that we play? And I would even suggest, the HIV epidemic severely impacted our eldership circles for today. I mean, we lost a lot of people. But I would even ask that question. I chaired Sage for a while, and I'm becoming more Sage-like. But this is a question I'm getting, what is my role? What is my purpose as a queer elder? As what purpose do I have to not just my queer community, but the broader community? And so we would create these retreats and these circles, and we would break these stories down. So I'll tell you one story about why I thought this was and this was not a business. This was, in fact, John and I would raise money so people could come to the event. So we would have to raise about $5,000 to get a group of 12 guys to go to this retreat center and participate. I won't tell you how we raised the money, but it was legit. Because we weren't a nonprofit or anything. It was just an idea that we were trying to grow. But we had an individual who would always sign up for the retreat and would never show up. He did this like 3 times. Finally, I think on the 3rd time, he showed up. And he was kind of a bigger guy. And we were sitting in a circle, and we had old guys and young guys. We had pretty boys and bear boys and lots of different kinds of guys there. And by the end of this retreat, he shared with us that the other retreats he had come, parked his car at the mouth of the driveway, and could not get the courage to show up because he had disqualified himself as kind of being gay worthy, if you will, to participate because he didn't think he was good enough, pretty enough, skinny enough, whatever enough. And then when he showed up and in the process of our unfolding of our stories, he said, well, I realize you pretty people are just as fucked up as I am. But what he was saying was he was able to find a bond with his brothers that had not been there because of all the internalized stuff that he had carried. And he may not have ever unfolded those stories in therapy, but he was able to do that in the space of community. And that was the value of Queer Spirit, was trying to bring people together and to just unfold the stories and find a way of celebrating some kind of rebirth or reemergence of something else. And so I feel like if I've done anything of worth, I'm very proud of Pride Counseling. I loved what we were able to do with Queer Spirit. I've done other stuff like activism and that, but there's something about witnessing people's transformational process through difficult times that has just been incredibly rewarding. And so I think that's my story.
What years was Queer Spirit running?
Probably the early 2000s. I don't know, I'd have to look. We kept a website up for a long time.
2000 to...
We'll have to ask Ben, because he actually wrote a story about us once.
Ben Williams?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
But it was, we did it for about 8 or 9 years, some version of it. And I still have small little circles that come into my home, and we might create ceremonial space to have these discussions. I think there's something very, a lot of cultures have ceremony to mark rites of passage. And so we created ceremony in this space to create a rite of passage, of stepping into our queerness, stepping into the magic of the purpose of who we were.
You mentioned outdoor space. Was that affected to the ceremony?
Did it affect the ceremony?
Yeah, what was the benefit of that, or?
Getting away from cell phones, getting away from internet, getting away from booze, getting away from those things that would normally distract us. People couldn't get away. No, we collected. But I mean, when you're out there, and I think there's something about the natural environment that invites us to let go of the facades. When you have to go shit in the woods, it's hard to have an image. No.
Well, the magic of a campfire, just a fire is.
In fact, that was what we would do, this big ceremonial bonfire. and we would release into the fire the stories that we needed to let go of. I'm not good enough. We would create effigies and spend all weekend decorating the effigies with the garbage that we wanted to let go of. And the fire would be a catalyst. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it.
So what are you doing right now, Jerry?
So right now, it's interesting at this kind of stage of my life, I've been able to kind of reinvent myself once again professionally. So I'm now teaching full time at the University College of Social Work. And I still maintain Pride counseling, but it's just me as a practitioner doing one-on-one counseling. And but my primary responsibility, which is interesting, I had this intention once. I wanted to be able to help shape mental health understanding around queer issues. And so now I get fresh 30 faces every 2 hours, and I can educate. And the whole therapeutic landscape, I think, has changed dramatically around these issues. So much so we now have a ban on conversion therapy. And you are going to have trouble. But we have a ban that I didn't think we'd ever see in this state, and frankly, we thought it would take a couple of years to get as far as we did. But the landscape is changing for the better.
Say something.
Now I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How hard was that for you to come out when you did? Like, I think it's a little bit different now. Like, to be able to put down on a paper, like, to be able to disclose as a therapist, like, offering, as a gay therapist, like, what kind of fears did you experience?
When I first started my practice and told people what I was going to do, the one thing I would hear frequently is that's professional suicide. Mm-hmm. And I just believed that that was not true. And I can honestly say that I did not deal with any negative repercussions. I've had some interesting phone calls. I've had people harass me through messages, but my professional community, I think, was aware enough at the time when I started it that I had to book at least a day and a half each week to do community work, because I'd be asked to go do presentations, to talk about the issues. And initially, the first couple of years, there were always people in the audience who wanted to fight. I'm Sicilian, let's fight. And it's a project that I've been involved in, Reconciliation and Growth, which is kind of a whole different story, but this is a group of therapists across ideological differences. So the conservatives on that group, on the initial group, used to track my presentations. It would always kind of show up with a following of people who wanted to argue with me. And so I got really good at public debate. What was interesting, at some point the audience shut them down. And so I would say there was a couple years where it was prickly, but for the most part, I think the professional community was hungry for good information, recognizing that the conservative-based information they were getting was not helpful. So.
What were the influences on you before you decided to become a therapist that people after becoming a therapist?
So I had, through my therapeutic process, I had the therapist who said I have no symptoms of gayness. I actually had a therapist recommend me to 3 of her friends that I could sleep with to find out if I was gay. Yeah. Part pimp, part therapist. I did the conversion therapy, and then my last therapist just really held good space for me to be self-exploratory on the issues. And I think there was a part of me early on that kept thinking, there's got to be a better way of doing this, right? Like, nobody's like really listening to me, and I was really conscious of that. And so, and I think I just had a personality style that lent itself to a helping profession. And I didn't want to learn math or do math, so I knew that psychiatry was out. And I like talking to people. I like that interactive piece. And so that's what kind of led me on the path of therapy. But I would argue that my best training in my therapeutic process has been my spiritual processes with, so I've spent a lot of time with Native American elders from different tribal connections who have, in fact, they opened this whole thing about queer has purpose. If you think about the traditions around the two-spirited people, in their tribal communities, these were sacred people who were looked to for sacred purposes, like for prayers or for helping with the children, but they had a particular place in the community. And I always thought that was interesting. So if my child were queer in a Native community pre-colonization, right, then you were taught how to honor your two-spiritedness or your queerness. And that always kind of blew my mind around our social constructs around queerness and how our civilization has not been so understanding. And so I feel like, and consequently I've done work in Mongolia, I've done work in Peru and Bolivia, and other places in the world working with very traditional teachings. And it has really kind of expanded my mind around possibility and what life can be like and how we can embrace joy and happiness in our lives. And I think I'm able to integrate that into my work without preaching about it, right? But it informs how I show up as a therapist. And so, I don't think there was anything profound other than bad experiences, but how I shaped my identity as a professional was informed by these elders and indigenous teachers.
You were involved with something, I can't remember what it was called, trying to meet with LDS people and get some understanding.
So that's reconciliation and growth.
Okay.
So that started about 8 years ago. And the issue of conversion therapy has been a hot ticket item in therapeutic circles for years. But there's been two camps. There's gay affirmative therapy or queer affirmative, and then there's been conversion therapy or religious dogma. And quite frankly, it doesn't allow for a spectrum of identities between religious conflict and sexual orientation. And so some of these people who are very much on the right, people who have said conversion therapy helped me, shaped me, defined me, people who practice conversion therapy, and then us progressive folks were over here. And so we've been meeting together frequently, at least twice a month, and kind of hammering out these issues and looking at what is good ethical practice, right? So I found my way out of Mormonism, and that worked really well for me. But there are some people who are going to stay committed to Mormonism. And sometimes our community is not very friendly to those people. We have a lot of historical trauma around Mormonism, and so it's like, you want to be Mormon? Get away from me. I don't want to, right? So we're trying to figure out how do we create dialogue and discussion that can be inclusive for those folks to find a place somewhere in community, to find some place therapeutically. And that's what reconciliation and growth has been about. And it's been a real challenge. This conversion therapy bill really put us to the test. I'm actually surprised we stayed together.
So is that just therapists or who's invited?
Yeah, it's just mental health professionals. And there's
the one I was talking about, I was invited to go once, many years ago, and all kinds of different people were there, parents.
It may be at a training event that we were doing, because we've gone out in the community to say, okay, how do we grapple with these issues? And so, like, for instance, next week I'm going up to LDS Family Services at the church office buildings, and we will be talking about what could be different over there. And to get an invitation back from them doesn't happen outside their circle very often, let alone from a big queer liberal that talks bad about them on Facebook. So, but that's been around nurturing relationships up there and trying to create dialogue and conversation to say, look, there's a way of coexisting here, and are there things perhaps we share philosophically that we could build some common ground around? So, yeah, so that's reconciliation and growth.
I'm curious what you think the bigger challenges are today with being gay as versus maybe when you came out, and how you would reconcile that with being an elder, a gay elder, and yourself at that time.
So what are the issues within our community that we could be working on, or?
What's the bigger issue? Like when I came out, it was visibility and stuff like that. But personally, I think now the bigger problem is connecting, actually on I don't want to say a physical level, but putting the phone down and having a conversation with someone. I think that there's a big divide between the youngins and me.
Well, I would certainly like to see in our communities some intergenerational work. Like when I chaired SAGE, one of my ambitions was, look, we are the wisdom keepers of our time, right? I mean, look at the stuff that we've lived through, and activism in the 80s and 90s looked very different than the 60s versus what it looks like today. And I think what I hear from a lot of my queer youth is, where are the elders? Where are the ones before us? They ask that question. They're like, I just would like someone to talk to that. And it's interesting, like my partner and I tend to attract a lot of younger folks who just want to, part of it is the spiritual circle that we kind of are part of, but people who are really wanting some of that parental influence, if you will, or even grandparent influence. And I think when we abandon our history, we lose parts of our identity. And so I think that's a critical piece that we really need to examine. I would say a social issue that I think is gaining momentum, but I think is still about 20 years behind the gay and lesbian movement, is getting our transgender folks up to speed, if you will, with some of the civil liberties that have come to us. Like, it's interesting legislatively, legislators want to support gay and lesbian people, yay, that's popular. But transgender people? Right? And so it gets marginalized very quickly in the political conversations. And I think gay and lesbian folks need to really be more mindful of how to be inclusive and kind of bring us all together so that we all hit that finish line together.
Yes.
So I think that's something we could do better as a community, and I think it's the big kind of next civil rights social movement. Obviously, Trump has kind of pushed us backwards in some places, but we know how to handle with disappointment, and so we need to kind of regroup and not abandon those causes, but get closer to them. Make them intimately ours, as opposed to theirs versus ours. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
What parts of Mormonism have you held on to with your shift in spiritual practice?
So this is what I tell people about my experiences with Mormonism. I think it took me to a particular place to be open to the idea of spirituality, and certainly, shaped a piece of my identity. So I felt like it took me here, and when I was here, I thought that was great. And what I've realized is it's kind of launched me to, as I'm working with these elders and these teachers and things that they have been able to share with me over the last 25 years, is I realize there's so much more than. And so, I started here. Mormonism got me here, and it propelled me to this different place. So I don't know that I make any distinctions between the values of Mormonism, for instance, and the values of respecting the environment, right? But it has been part of a projection. And so I'm very grateful for my LDS pass. I mean, I don't like what I see happening politically in LDS circles, but in terms of helping to shape who I am today, it was a critical piece of my life, a stepping stone.
It has to be interesting in your practices. You're seeing people with Mormon backgrounds learning new spiritual practice and being able to demonstrate that.
Yeah, I think one thing I've always, the stereotype is we're a bunch of heathens. It certainly was a stereotype back in the old days, right? What I've always noticed with my clients is we all have a piece of spirituality within us, right? And so what I've noticed is that clients that I've worked with who have been perhaps rejected or perceived to be rejected from their religions have moved from an institutional experience to a personal one. And whether that's shaped by Mormonism, Catholicism, or just spirituality, right? I just noticed that queer clients tend to personalize it and make it their own. And so as a therapist, I certainly want to help amplify that.
You stated that you'd had a fairly profound conversion experience leading you to believe in Mormonism. How do you reconcile that now? Because I struggle with that. I had when I was 18 years old, very profound, visionary, like literally visionary experience that said Mormonism. So I threw myself into it as you did. And now I look back and go, what happened? Because I certainly don't believe anymore. I've completely thrown the baby out with the bathwater and the bathtub and the concept of bathing.
We carry this dirt. So let me tell you.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So this is my perspective on that. I think part of the socialization process of Mormonism is that when the heavens open, that's about because you're on the right path, and that's in the container of Mormonism. And so we're socialized to believe that there's only one place where the good stuff comes from. And so at some point I just kind of recognized that spirit, however you want to define that, God, Gaia, Goddess, God, whatever, that spirit has multiple ways of manifesting itself. And it can manifest itself in Mormonism, and it can be powerful. And frankly, my experience took me to a place in my life where I needed to be to learn something. And then the shaman banging on his drum in Mongolia is also channeling spirit in a way that is in relationship to him and the land and the ancestors. And when I'm in a sweat lodge, I can experience that. And so I've given up the idea that somehow Mormonism has the sole property rights of spiritual manifestations. And so I went to Italy and was at what do they call the place where the Catholics hang out?
Vatican.
The Vatican. That place.
Temple Square for Catholics.
You're Sicilian?
I know, right? I'll hear from my ancestors tonight. No. But, I went to the Vatican and had this really amazing kind of spiritual experience, right? And I just, in my mind, I think... What's that?
It was all those queer bishops.
There you go. It was all the drag. But I could go to that place and be in deep gratitude that that some ancestral connection showed itself to me. And it happened with Mormonism. It's happened in lots of different ceremonies. It's happened at the Vatican. And I'm glad that the Creator has a very eclectic way of connecting to us. And I'm just going to respect and honor all of it. that's how I do it.
Oh.
Oh.
Anything else? Any more questions?
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Put that in the archives. No.
Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and